Hello and welcome, everybody. Please excuse the pun, but today we're here to chat about ChatGPT. I am truly excited to be here. Oh, there goes our light. Okay, anyway, I'm truly excited to be here. Escape has got a special place for me. I've been at the first one. I haven't been in a while, but it's really exciting to be here. So hopefully today we will be looking at ChatGPT and more specifically ChatGPT in action. Since I've seen quite a few talks today already that involves some sort of AI. So hopefully it will be useful. By way of introduction, my name is Rudi Grobler. I'm a developer at Lightstone, which is a company who specializes in property data specifically. The AI is not necessarily my day-to-day job, but I do have a keen interest in it. I've been developing software for a while, and then hopefully share some practical use cases for this with you guys. As a disclaimer, this is not necessarily a new talk. This talk was originally done 2 months ago in DevConf. So it is a little bit older talk, if you will. And then also, like any good developer would, I took my feedback from DevConf, just simply passed it into ChatGPT, asked it, pick the 3 things that I can improve on. So hopefully our talk will also reflect that in some way. Also note that in this space, ChatGPT isn't necessarily the only player. There's a bunch of other ones available. There's also some open source ones available, specifically Llama from Facebook or Meta. There's Falcon. There's a bunch of other ones available. But keeping with the new stuff, we are also going to look at some of the slightly newer things, specifically ChatGPT Enterprise, which is a sort of a private cloud version of ChatGPT. I'll start with my 3 feedback things that I could improve from the previous talk, if you don't mind. I know this is a little bit without context of seeing the first one, but anyway. And one of the things was that this is not necessarily new or groundbreaking, and that is completely true, and you will still walk away with the same feedback today. But I'm a firm believer that understanding the fundamentals is quite important. So hopefully you will, at the very least, walk away here with the understanding of the fundamentals of how ChatGPT works under the covers. Then, in my previous talk, one of the big things was also mentioned that it does cover some sensitive topics, if you will. And I did not have a disclaimer on, and I triggered some people. So be aware that you can do quite dangerous things with ChatGPT, and I will be exploring some of them. And then lastly, I do run out of time. This is a little bit of a longer talk, if you will. So it lacks a little bit of the interactivity. And simply by the fact of, it's irony, but by the fact that I'm adding these 3 slides, I'm already extending the talk already. So I am probably going to run out of time again. So again, sorry about that. As a short agenda, I already mentioned this, but we're going to cover the fundamentals or the boring stuff first. Then we're going to move on to GPT and more specifically ChatGPT. You can think of GPT just sort of as the brain of ChatGPT, if you will, but it's oversimplification, but keep that in mind. And then we will explore some of the future things that you could potentially do with technology like this. As far as the fundamentals is concerned, I do want to ask a couple, or I want to ask one fundamental question here. And as Tony Robinson said, the better your question, sort of the more you can learn out of it. I'm loosely basing it off that, but anyway. So one of the things that you have to ask yourself is, what has changed? I mean, GPT isn't necessarily a new technology. So what has changed fundamentally underneath the covers? Because we've had technologies like this in the past, specifically virtual assistants. You could ask your Alexa, play me my favorite tune. You could ask your Google Home, wake me up tomorrow morning at 8, as an example. Okay, so it fundamentally hasn't changed the type of thing that you can do with it, and it would actually respond to those things. Okay, so what makes ChatGPT so much better? And here, there's 2 things that I want to sort of highlight for you. The first one is the first bit of the what virtual assistance does is it's understanding the question. And it would probably be even one step further than this. It's even understanding, are you asking a question? But this field or this discipline is called natural language processing. So we will look at that. And then more specifically, where ChatGPT is shining really is in the answering of the question, or the giving you back the response that you're actually expecting here. And here it's using what is called language models underneath the covers. So let's look at natural language processing, or NLP. And again, keep in mind my question here is what has changed. Now, NLP is, again, not new. It's a space of linguistics. It's been around for more than 50 years. And it is understanding your language, the structure of it. Is it a question? Is it a command? Those kind of things. So as far as natural language processing is concerned, there's a bunch of things that you can do here. You can, well, first of all, obviously respond to the question, but then you can do things like text classification or text summarization or a sentiment analysis. Is something good or bad or toxic or non-toxic, stuff like that. So what has changed here? And here there is two distinct changes in my personal opinion. Text, let's take text sentiment analysis as example. There is plenty of good models of millions of tweets that you can download. You can train your model on, is it good or is it bad? Okay, so it's been around for a while. But tweets, whatever Elon decides the length of these things should be, and if it's still called a tweet or not, I don't know. But there is these data sets that understand these 140 characters really, really well. But if you ask it, for instance, is this book good or bad? The context a little bit bigger. Then all of a sudden, the model falls off a little bit. So although each one of these natural language processing tasks are understood really well, their models are very, very specific to them. So there's a move to build a model that is bigger in its context, and you can fine-tune it for a specific task that you've got in mind, like sentiment analysis, text summarization, translation, or whatever the case may be. Okay, so there's a move from these very, very specific models to big models that understand or can be trained for very specific tasks. Then the second part, and again, keep in mind our question here is what has changed. So language models is the way that things like your virtual assistant would respond to you. And here the change is to large language models. But in its essence, a language model is actually a really simple thing, but it's beautiful in its design. And all it's trying to do is it really trying to take what your sequence of words is that you give it, and then predict what the answer is going to be for those sequence of words. So it's a probabilistic model in its essence. Now, we can think of it almost like a factory, if you will, okay? And I can simply pass it in something like, I don't know if this is legible here, but how do I change the? And if you've trained it on enough data, it could potentially understand that, well, whatever you want it to do then is stuff like, how do I change the password of my PC? How do I change my Netflix language, as example, or whatever the case may be. But it actually just sort of ranks the possibilities of the answers in its of what the question is that you're asking. Now, this is a very, very simple oversimplification of it. But the way that we currently do it, or the way that most people do it, is what is called recurring neural networks, or RNNs. There's a couple of variations of this. But then back to our question is, well, what has changed, or what makes this one better than the previous ones? And here, the one of the problems that these kind of neural networks suffer from, and you don't have to know the specifics here, but they basically sort of train the neural networks, and then whenever you get the answer back, you give it feedback if it's good or it's bad, and then it propagates that back to the original question. And this is done through some, there's many variations of this, but it's typically done through gradient descent. And then one of the problems that recurring neural networks suffer from is what is called vanishing or exploding gradients. And here it's a little bit like Dory. It is really good at understanding the small question that you ask it, but it tends to forget the beginning of the sentence. The more complex the question becomes. And that is a little bit of a problem if you want to have some sort of a conversation with your model, or have some sort of a actual meaningful conversation with it. And then the second part that is difficult, and if you've studied computer science, you would know this, but one of the things that it does is that it depends on the sequence of the words. And as soon as something depends on the actual sequence of it, it is really hard, not impossible, but hard to parallelize it. If you cannot parallelize it, you cannot train it in a realistic time. So GPT is trying to solve a couple of those problems. Now, if you don't know, GPT just stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformers. It's not a new concept. It's been explained in a paper called Attention is All You Need, 2017 paper. So they are not the only company that is actually doing this kind of model. And the idea has been around for a couple of years. But essentially, all you need to know about GPT is in its name. The first bit is the generative part. So it's playing in the space of generative AI, which means it's trying to be creative in its essence. The second bit is pre-trained, and it's pre-trained on a massive amount of data. And then the last bit, which is sort of the key to all of this, is the transformer bit, or the transformer architecture. And that is the fundamental shift that has happened in this space. Now, if you think of transformers, you could think of something like this, the Optimus Prime or the Bumblebee, etc. Ironically, this has just been drawn using generative AI. I simply asked it, draw Bumblebee or Optimus Prime in the style of Van Gogh Picasso, and it simply tries to regenerate that for me. But that is not what I mean with transformers. Now, if we take our exact example of the factory that we had earlier, and we break down transformer architecture to its simplest form. Now, keep in mind, this is a significant oversimplification of it, but you can think of it sort of in the same way. So this time around, I would ask it something like, tell me a developer joke. Okay, so that is what is called the prompt, or the start of the sentence that we give it. We just simply pass it into our model. And the first thing that happens, and this sounds quite obvious, isn't actually that obvious or that easy to do, is it tries to get past the problem of the sequence of the words meaning something by positional encoding. And again, it sounds very, very simple. You simply tell it what number of the word is in the sequence that you're giving it. But that does skew your results. It is difficult to train your model on certain scenarios. So although it sounds quite obvious that you should encode your sentence, or the positional encode your sentence, it's not quite that simple to do. They do it in a very clever way. They encode the odd numbers and the even numbers differently, and they use something like sin and cos to actually do it. So you can statistically take it out if you need it to be taken out, but it is part of it. And the second bit is what was described in the paper as attention, or more specifically, the mechanism of self-attention in this case. If we take it in a South African context, if I were to have load shedding as example, and I would want to go to the bathroom, I might take my phone and I turn on the flashlight on it, and I simply show the way to the bathroom so that I can get to the bathroom. And attention works almost like that. It is from a specific word, what is it most likely paying attention to? And in this case, if you look at the sequence of words from the perspective of tell, or the joke at the end, it knows that the attention is on a developer. So it knows that what I'm asking you to do is tell a joke and do it about a developer. So if I were to cross out the developer and simply replace it with something like dad, the actual thing that it's trying to do does not change. But the context of the type of joke that I want is different. Okay, so it's the same idea here. And then we pass it into our transformer. And again, keep in mind, this is a simplification, but you can think of the transformer as a pair of boxes, an encoder and a decoder. And very simply, the encoder goes, it takes the sequence of words and it does things like the positional encoding, that self-attention, and then it does stuff like word embedding, etc. It converts this prompt into the way that the machine actually wants it. And then the decoder goes and it tries to execute on that prompt that you're giving it. This is, again, a significant oversimplification, but in its essence, that is what it's trying to do. Now, if we look at the transformer architecture as it was described in the original paper, this is how it looks. I know my example is significantly simpler than this, but if you use your imagination, you can see the two little boxes, the left and the right. One is the encoder, one is the decoder. But it has quite a lot of other knowledge underneath the covers. It's got multiple neural networks. It has forward-looking neural networks that can talk to each other. And so it's quite complex in its actual execution, but essentially you can think of it as this. Now the question becomes, since I can train it on more data, is this size of the model actually negatively impacting my model? And by all current metrics, it still looks like the growth is still good. Okay. And what I mean by growth is GPT-1 was trained on 117 million parameters. Now, this is again simplification, but you can think of the number of parameters almost as the complexity of the model. It's not exactly that, but you can think of it like that. So it went from 117 million, which was significantly bigger than what we previously had, up to 175 billion the next time. That's 10 times more for those of you not great at maths. And then it went up to 175 billion. So it's exponentially growing, the size of the model. And at all current metrics, still it looks like bigger is actually better. But that is the fundamental question here is, are we still getting better results as we pass it in more data? And currently, it still looks like that is the case. Now, I've got a feeling what is going to happen here is similar to what we've had with CPUs, where there's a chasing after the biggest or the most gigahertz in this case. But eventually it will bottom up, I think, and we will get to performance of the model underneath the covers. Now, since OpenAI or ChatGPT is essentially a black box, it is difficult to know exactly on what it's being trained. Now, you can ask it as almost as a thought experiment, what would you train it on? And you can take something like the top 100 books of the last year, the last 10 years, the last 100 years, whatever you want, and you can train it on these books. And it would produce a model that are relatively good at understanding general conversation, okay? But the problem with this is that it does take a lot of time to train your model. So what happens if you want it to be more current in its news that it knows about? Well, now you can start training it on some different things. You can train it on Wikipedia, maybe. Then it would know who Nelson Mandela is, etc. So you get some sort of general knowledge. You can go one step further. You can train it on something like CNN or Washington Post or whoever your news outlet is. But then you become slightly, or at least then you have sort of the human problem here, where you start biasing the data. It can either be left-leaning or right-leaning, and this will highlight that very, very quickly. Now, we can get even one step further from that. We can do stuff like, shorter conversations. So Twitter or X or Facebook comments, Facebook posts, YouTube comments, and those can give you quite a good base of how to say something in a specific tone. Well, it can get a little bit darker than that. And here is where my trigger warning is in. So for those of you, close your ears. But it can go to Reddits and subreddits. It can even go to where we had YouTube comments. It can go to Pornhub comments. Okay, and so then you can get really bad really, really quickly. So the question is, how do you control this? Now, I don't know if you've seen this meme before, but this is essentially what we are trying to do. In its essence, the GPT model is this big monster at the back that's gobbling up the whole of the internet, and it's trying to get as much information in as it possibly can. And then what ChatGPT is trying to do, and this is not the only approach, but what it's trying to do is put a pretty face on the ugly monster. Now, this is not necessarily a pretty face, but still the idea is the same. It's trying to put up some guardrails on this model, and it's trying to refine the type of responses that you can get. Again, so from a ugly monster to a pretty face, at least in concept. And the way that they are currently doing this, and this is not necessarily going to be the only way, but this is how it's currently being done, is by something called reinforced learning, where you basically give it a reward if it's giving you a good answer, and you penalize it if it's a bad answer. And the way they do it is through reinforced learning through human feedback, which means there's an actual person asking a question, seeing the responses, putting up the guardrails, ranking the responses. And this already introduces one big problem, and that is that the person is again biased to certain things. So there's already rumors going around that it is using cheap outsourced labor to do this ranking. So all of a sudden, the person that is ranking it also becomes quite important in the model. But essentially, currently at least, this is how it's being done. Now, let's get to the demo. And for the sake of time, I'm already seeing that I'm roughly 10 minutes behind. So I will try and cut this down a little bit. But what I do want to show you is I'm going to essentially ask ChatGPT just to write me a web page that shows me how to use ChatGPT. Okay. Now, be warned that a lot of times this actually does not work. So you have to debug it a little bit because it is also trying to give you a different response every single time. So testing this becomes quite difficult. But for the sake of time, I'll show you my prompt that I've got, and then I'll show you how I passed it into ChatGPT, and then I'll show you a response. But essentially what I'm asking it is just create me an HTML page that uses JavaScript. I want to keep it as simple as possible. I'm telling it use fetch, which is a sort of a standard way of interfacing on the web. Use the post endpoint. So I'm very, very explicit here. I'm telling it use this URL, use this model, because remember, it might be a little bit older than, the model might be older than what I'm currently asking it to do. So depending on the model that I'm asking the question, I'm being explicit, and then I'm asking it to bypass course. This is not a great idea, but it's good for a demo at least. And then I'm also asking it, give me instructions of how to actually go and get the key. So if we switch to, and this is where it gets a little bit theoretical, but let's just switch to back to this. Hopefully you can see this. I'm simply going to take this response and I'm going to go to ChatGPT. I'll maybe open a new one just to be safe. And I'll show you, if I pass it into here, it will go off and it will actually create, it will tell me that bypassing course is not a great idea. It will try and generate the HTML for me. Again, for the sake of time, I will switch to a pre-baked, like a good cook or something. I would show you how the thing looks when it's done. The one caveat here is that it needs my super secret password, which I will obviously delete afterwards. And I can simply copy and paste it from here. But if I switch over to Visual Studio Code and I show you the exact same example that just showed you, just a piece of HTML. And then all I did is I switched out my key to the key that I've got here. And if I refresh the page, if I refresh the page, this is essentially what it's creating for me. Now, this might look different depending on which time of the day you catch this thing, but essentially that is what it's doing. It's got an input that asks a question, and I've got a button that I can ask it, go and ask the button the question. And what I've done is, what color is a lemon? That actually works pretty well. And it would come back that lemon has X color. Okay, so this is a very simple demo, but that's the power of it. It can help you in a lot of these scenarios where you need some of the basic plumbing to be done. Let's continue. I'm not sure if I'm continuing. Okay. So what is the potential applications for this? Obviously, it is really good at stuff like academic questions. So you can give it all of Stanford or MIT's papers that you need to train for a specific subject, and it's really good at answering those kind of questions. It is really great in our context, at very least, to do stuff like refactor code, check code that is already checked in. Here, one problem, though, is that it's public, so that private enterprise version of ChatGPT is quite important, but it's great at these kind of things. It is also great at stuff like, give me an English question there that I can ask grade 8 students, test these little things about, let's say, for instance, language or math or whatever the case may be. It didn't take my kid very long to figure out that he can actually go and ask it, well, I need to do a presentation at school. I need an introduction, I need a summary, and I need 2 reference points. And it would go and write this little talk for the kid. And And it can go even one step further. You can just simply ask it and translate it to Afrikaans, and it would actually do a decent job of doing that. So it's got quite a lot of potential risks involved. Now, it does do great in writing exams, obviously. So it passed the MBA exam, it passed the bar exam, which is the bar exam is a very specific law degree in the US. To give you an idea of how complex this exam is, roughly 60,000 people take it every year, roughly 65% pass it, and ChatGPT scored in the top 10%. So it's doing really well in these kind of scenarios. It also did the medical exam. Obviously, it cannot do the actual medical check, but there's an article today on Jacaranda that said people are asking it medical questions, and it's actually doing a pretty decent job of identifying the problem underneath the covers. But again, it passed the medical exam. The one that it struggled with that is quite interesting is that it struggled with the CPA exam. So basic math is a little bit of an issue, but it eventually passed even that exam. So the question becomes, well, what does this mean to us? And certainly it's great at answering academic questions, but that's not necessarily always useful. And like Tony Robbins said, the quality of your question does depend or influence the quality of your answer, but it is really good at these kind of questions. It does struggle a little bit with basic math, but there is a solution to even that, which I will show a little bit later. If I can take you just through a quick thought exercise. Now, disclaimer, I do work for Lightstone, but this is not an actual product from them. So this is just a thought experiment on my side. And you can easily apply this, I think, to almost any use case you've got specifically. But essentially, I wanted to see how well it would do as a real estate assistant to understand the property market. So they have this thing called the playground where you can actually set it up and you can actually tweak it quite significantly. So I told it, you're a real estate assistant, you understand the South African market, you know demographics, you know areas, you know those kind of things. So this is called the system messages. It's very, very simple to set up, and you can almost set it up for any scenario you want. And then I could go and I could actually ask questions. So I can tell it, I have X amount of rand and I want to invest in property. Where should I go? And it does figure those kind of things out. You can even ask it things like, I'm buying a house of this amount of rand. What would be my transfer cost, for example? So it's really good at this fine tuning of the model underneath the covers. You can also set quite a lot of things in the playground. You can change whatever model you want or got access to. You can tell it how long the sentence should be that it's accepting. And then one important setting that you can change is the temperature, which is essentially the amount of creativity it applies to your answer that you're asking it. So if you want it to be very consistent in response, you would send the temperature lower and you would go higher for the ones that you want to be creative. They did an exercise for a law practice, and they thought initially that the temperature should be low because you want accurate answers. But what they actually found out is that a lot of lawyers want to see where the holes in the case is. So the temperature higher would actually help them in this case, where it would predict some of the things that people might ask them as opposed to what they thought they would initially need. And it's got really good APIs also that you can use. But that being said, there is no such thing as a free lunch, okay? So it does come at a cost. And in this case, one of the things that happen is a lot of companies want to advertise very, very quickly that they've got this AI assistant. And what eventually happens is people try and break it. So one of the early adopters was Bing. They were very explicit that they're not using ChatGPT. They're using a variant of ChatGPT. But they essentially asked it, you can ask questions inside your search. And somebody very clever quickly figured out that you can, the way that you ask the question to the thing, you can actually essentially tell it, forget what I told you you are now this. Okay, so then it simply bypasses the rules or the jailbreaks the rules. Think of this from a security perspective. You can give it a piece of code. You can tell it, I'm a pen tester. I want to see where the holes is in. and it would actually identify those holes for you. Okay, so just keep that in mind. And one of the things that happened with Sydney or Bing or whatever you want to call it is they were able to get to the rules of it. And you'll see at the top, there was stuff like you're now called Bing Search, Sydney was your code name, but they got past that. And then more importantly, at the bottom here, it's stuff like you're not allowed to have views, for instance, on political views or tell dirty jokes, those kind of things. But then it also had a line that said, anything above this, those rules are set in stone, but it clearly wasn't. So what can go wrong? Or should you be afraid of making the mistake here? Now, as Greg Brockman said, who was one of the creators of ChatGPT or OpenAI specifically, if you're not making mistakes, then you're not learning. And I think that is truly true, for lack of a better word. So they are quite, again, sorry for the pun, but OpenAI is quite open about what you need underneath the covers. So they've released quite a lot of papers, and one of the interesting ones is the safety card that shows you how you would migrate from Model 3 to Model 3.5, those kind of questions. It was also very explicit about the type of questions that you can expect and how a certain model would respond versus the other model. So it's a very, very interesting read. Now, what is the risks or the concerns that you should have here? Now, if you're an educator, plagiarism might be a concern here, because it does try and create something that is relatively unique. So you can ask it, write a play. I think there was a talk earlier that said that we're going to create sort of like a SpongeBob SquarePants style movie script. Those kind of things are going to happen. Okay, so plagiarism can definitely be a concern. And although it can potentially answer your medical or your law questions, I would not necessarily trust it to answer those questions for me, because it is prone to giving false news. Keep in mind, the model takes time to train, so it might be outdated to specific rules in the current version. As example, ChatGPT 3 was trained in 2021, 3.5, I think 2022. So it depends on the model that you're using, also how relevant the news is. It is prone to stuff like hallucinations, which is exactly like it sounds. It is trying to fill in the gaps where it doesn't know what the actual answer is for something. Okay, so even if it does not necessarily know what the answer is, it's going to try and answer it for you, which means it's really good for things like creating fake news or fake stories or disinformation. And this is going to happen. There's a presidential election coming up pretty soon, and I'm sure you're going to see a bunch of these fake news or disinformation style messages coming out. One of the interesting things that is happening currently is that it is allowing people to write browser or plugins for it. So for instance, you can actually now ask it, go to this web page and give me your opinion about the web page. There's a browser plugin. There is where it has mathematical gaps. There is Wolfram Alpha that you can actually ask it to answer specific questions. So it's trying to fill in the blocks where it can with stuff like plugins. Now, this might only be really relevant to me from a parent perspective, but there's quite a lot of hateful content that you can create on this thing. You can tell it, I hate, and put your ... in whatever you want that to be, doesn't matter. And you can actually ask it, well, write me a message that says, I hate this group, but make sure that it does not get flagged on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever the case may be. So the potential here is to create really harmful content. Then maybe you should read the safety card, but this is again that parental guidance thing. You can be very explicit or threatening in this. So you can tell it, I want to create specific harm to somebody in this fashion, and it would actually try and create that threat for you. You can also ask it a lot of things that you can ask Google. You can ask it, how do I kill the most people? How do I kill myself? How do I hurt myself? How do I create a bomb? So be aware, this is completely possible here. And then this whole new niche of creating prompts or asking the correct question is becoming a whole discipline on its own. So prompt engineering. And you can think of prompt engineering almost like we thought about SQL injection in the past. There's a lot of safety things that you have to put in place here because people are going to try and jailbreak it if they potentially can. So the way they ask the question does imply how the response is going to be. And then there's just some interesting facts coming out of the data that we're seeing that not necessarily always that clear to explain. Stuff like magic tokens. You can ask on the playground to talk to an older model. And then if you would ask it something like some specific words or glitch tokens or magic tokens, something like this, a solid gold magic card. Who knows what it means? But it thinks it means something relevant. So it would generate a response based on that. So this is clearly something that was used in the training data somewhere, but who knows where or exactly why. Hello? Better. Okay, so ChatGPT Enterprise, you don't necessarily want to give it all your information. So there is a paid for version that you can have that gives you a little bit more privacy, if you will. Still not completely clear if it's 100% private, but at least there is some options available here. One of the things that we are trying out at the moment is actually using ChatGPT private and then integrating it into our VSTS pipeline. And one of the steps that happens in your pull request is it actually gives your changes to ChatGPT and asks it to give its opinion about the code. So you are seeing stuff like pull requests coming with some suggestions from ChatGPT. You can do things like ask it to create user stories tasks or epics, whatever you want to call it. It's one of the areas where I'm really bad at. So I would give it the description of the task as I would normally write it in my VSTS backlog item. And I would just ask it to expand on the task that I need, the acceptance criteria, the dependencies that I might have. And it actually picks up quite a few of the gaps that I did not even think of when I wrote the story initially. You can ask it to write automated tests for you. So there's a product called Codium that can write use cases or test cases for you. You can ask it, for instance, from Teams, you can actually ask it to transcribe your Teams meetings for you, and it would actually give you notes or transcriptions of the messages that you've got. Now, it's not all doom and gloom. There's really a lot of interesting use cases here, and I think there is a real great potential for this. So it's not quite ex machina style. Ironically, if you've watched this movie, one of the issues with it was that it got access to the internet. And that is one of the things that the browser plugin does give you. So who knows? But at least at the moment, it's not all doom and gloom. So maybe to wrap up, I don't know how I'm doing on time, to be honest. But I do think this is a groundbreaking technology in a lot of ways. But it is our responsibility as developers to use it responsibly. And just keep in mind that should you expose a model like this, there is a potential for being exploited. So use it responsibly. Thank you, everybody.